seated. Well, I appreciate your patience with the scrambled bulletin, but we needed to hear that word from John 1, the traditional Christmas Day reading, after we hear on Christmas Eve the story from Luke chapter 2 that is wonderfully familiar, with a baby in a manger and shepherds in the fields. Now we hear John's take, a little bit different. Got me thinking this week about a video that I saw. I was shown it in school. I mean, we were barely beyond the age of film strips, but somehow I saw this video, and it really captured my imagination as a kid. So, of course, I had to look it up on YouTube, and through the magic of YouTube, they're all available. You just have to look a little. Maybe some of you know this one. It's called The Powers of 10. It was put out, it was created in 1977, and I was quite impressed. I don't know how they did this without computer-generated images back in those days, but it's this fascinating little video that was put together to give you a sense of exponential things, exponentially large and small, the powers of 10. And what it is, it starts out with some people having a picnic in a park in Chicago, and the field of view is 1 meter square. And then every 5 seconds, your field of view grows exponentially by 1 power of 10. So 5 seconds later, we're zooming out, and now the field of view is 10 meters square, and another 5 seconds it's 100 meters square, and pretty soon the Earth starts getting smaller and smaller, and we see the other planets in the sun, and they get smaller and smaller, and then other stars zoom into view, and pretty soon we're looking at one arm of the Milky Way, and then the Milky Way starts getting smaller. It's quite amazing. And then about 5-6 minutes into the video, it says, okay, now we're going the other way. And you zoom back in on that picnic in the park in Chicago, and we start zooming in on one person, and then on their hand, and then pretty soon we're looking at cells, and we're looking at molecules and atoms, and we get as small as we can go. You can imagine how, for a kid, that caught my imagination, right? The scope of things. How big the universe is. How tiny is an atom. Well, this zooming out and in is something that all the gospel writers do to try to help us understand the scope of what God is doing in this simple birth of a child. We get a little bit of it in Luke. Even if you just read that traditional reading, Luke chapter 2, it starts out with the emperor, Caesar Augustus, has called for an enrollment, a census throughout the Roman Empire. So we're in the realm of geopolitics and the high and mighty. And then it says, and in Galilee and Judea, in this little town of Nazareth, there was a man named Joseph. And we zoom in on Joseph and Mary. And pretty soon, we're in something like a little stable on the outskirts of Bethlehem. And that's where the action is. Out of the way, somewhere no one's ever thought to look. Some people no one had heard of. From the large to the small. And then we get it again, right? We're with some shepherds out in the field. Again, people, they've forgotten about him. We don't even know their names. And the heavens open. And the angels are singing. We get a sense of the cosmic scale of what is happening on this holy night. Well, then we turn to John chapter 1, and it's as if the gospel writer John says, well, nice try, Luke, but it's bigger than that. Did you hear these words? John says, to talk about what God is doing in this event we call Christmas, we've got to go back to the beginning of time. In the beginning. As one of my professors said, this is like writing a novel and starting it. It was the best of times and it was the worst of times. If you're going to steal the best beginning line ever, you better have a good novel. All right? He takes the words from the beginning of Genesis, in the beginning, and says, in the beginning was the Word. And let me tell you about the Word who has come among us. He goes back to the beginning of time, to the creation of light. Let there be light. He says, now the light has come among us in a new way. And for a while we dwell at creation, speaking of the Word that John is soon going to reveal. He believes has become incarnate in Jesus Christ, was there from the beginning. Nothing was created apart from him, he says. He was there. We see the scope of the whole universe, life itself, light itself. These things that originate with God at the beginning of time now are revealed anew in the Word come among us. And after we've made this cosmic scope of things, then we get to verse 14 that says, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us." I don't know what that word flesh evokes for you. Certainly it refers to the birth of a child that we celebrate today. But the Word became flesh. What does that mean? It means he didn't just appear to be a human being. He was truly human. Jesus had cells. Jesus had a genetic code. Jesus breathed the same air we breathe. I was thinking of you, Neil. You loaned me a book on diffusion in gases, and it uses an example, the breaths taken by famous people. So we might think of that first breath of the baby Jesus. Breathes in oxygen atoms that are then breathed out and are still part of the atmosphere today. And you can calculate how likely it is you've breathed some of them. I think you may have. He's made of the stuff we are made of. He has fully entered into, from the Milky Way to our DNA, God has entered into this world. We live in a God-infused world, says John. That's what's happening here. Nice try, other gospel writers, but it's bigger than that. And we in our time are perhaps confronted by this in new ways. In 1968, on Christmas Day, Apollo 8, a crew of 3 men, were orbiting the moon for the first time. The first time human beings had reached the moon to be able to orbit it. A year later, Apollo 11 would finally make the moon landing. And on Christmas Day, they were on the right side of the moon, where they could speak to Houston and make an address to the people of Earth. Some of you may remember this. They gave a personal greeting, and then they read, "In the beginning." From orbiting the moon, looking back at the tiny planet Earth, they read to the people of Earth, "In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth." Read those first several verses of the book of Genesis from space. And on that same orbit, they took what is probably the most famous picture to come out of all the work of the Apollo missions. They, for the first time, were used to seeing the moon rise on the horizon of the earth or seeing the sun rise on the horizon of the earth. They watched the earth rise across the horizon of the moon and snapped a famous picture that transformed our own perspective on ourselves to see that little planet. Well, what does it mean for those human beings out in the cosmos, seeing the lights that light our planet, orbiting one of them? What does it mean for them to realize the God who said, "Let there be light," the God who created light itself, comes on Christmas Day as a baby born among us? But I tell you, as amazing as all this is, what we celebrate on Christmas, this is not something God's done to impress us. We aren't just to be impressed by the magnitude of God, and we're to understand that God has permeated all of reality for a reason. We hear it in the letter to Titus. Titus doesn't say Jesus was a baby born. Titus says the grace of God has appeared in our midst. Titus, in the letter to Titus, it says, "Now the goodness and loving kindness of God has appeared." God has an agenda in permeating creation. God has a plan. In the letter of Titus, it says that he might bring salvation and mercy to all. The Christmas angels name that agenda good news of great joy, bringing peace on earth goodwill, God's warm, loving inclination toward the world. And John ends his majestic prologue saying, he's come among us full of grace and truth. God has entered creation for a reason. Well, this has great implications for creation and for humanity. For creation, we realize that creation isn't an object apart from God that God has created and remains separate from. No. God has come alongside creation. God has entered into creation. God has sided completely with creation in total solidarity. What does that mean, that the Creator would side once and for all with the creation itself? It's God's will, we realize today, that all things be undergirded and permeated with love. And what it means for humanity, right? That this God, the Creator of all things, who was from the beginning, becomes human. Well, we who among creation are to be in the image of God, the image of God is restored in Christ come among us. This relationship we were to have with God from the beginning, to have some understanding of what God's up to join with God in caring for the rest of creation, that relationship is renewed. And perhaps most powerfully, we realize that in taking on all of our stuff, Jesus is making an exchange. An exchange, taking on our humanity, our flesh, on the cross, finally taking on our sin and our mortality as well. He is offering us what he brings to this relationship. During communion, we'll sing, the second hymn we'll sing has a wonderful verse. I want to end with it here. Speaking praise to Christ, we'll sing. A wonderful exchange you make. You take our flesh and blood, and in return give us to share the shining realm of God. A wonderful exchange you make. You take our flesh and blood, and in return give us to share the shining realm of God.